In the summer of 1857, on the wide lands of Boone Hall Plantation in South Carolina, 51 black children woke up every day knowing they were not seen as human. They were numbers written in a ledger, property listed beside horses, plows, and bags of grain. Yet inside those small bodies worn down by work and hunger, something unusual was taking place, something their enslavers never expected, something that would later become one of the most hidden and painful stories of American slavery. Before we go on, remember to subscribe to the channel and comment which city you are listening from. Now, let's continue. This is not a story found in most history books. The records were broken apart, the names were removed, the witnesses carried their secrets to the grave. But the bricks these children made with their small hands still remain today in the streets of Charleston. And if you look carefully, you can still see their fingerprints pressed into the clay. Fingerprints of children, some only 6 years old. This is the truth of what happened to the 51 children of Boone Hall. Once you hear it, you will not forget it. The year was 1857. The nation was splitting apart. In the North, abolitionists were becoming louder. In the South, plantation owners were growing richer. And in the low country of South Carolina, the Hallbeck family had turned Boone Hall into one of the most successful brick-making operations in the region. They supplied materials used to build Fort Sumter. They provided bricks for Charleston's finest homes. They were admired, they were wealthy, and they achieved all of it through the steady exploitation of human beings, including children who should have been learning to read, running through open fields, and dreaming of their futures. Instead, those children worked in the kilns. To understand what happened in 1857, you must first understand Boone Hall. The plantation was founded in 1681 by Major John Boone, one of South Carolina's earliest English settlers. From the start, the land depended on enslaved labor. First rice was grown, then cotton, then indigo. When the Hallbeck brothers bought the property in 1817, everything shifted. Henry and John Hallbeck were German immigrants with a plan. They saw the deep clay deposits on the land. They saw the growing need for building materials in Charleston. And they saw the hundreds of enslaved people already living there. To them, it was simple math. They would turn field workers into brickmakers. They would build kilns. They would produce millions of bricks every year. And they would become some of the richest men in the South. By 1850, Boone Hall was producing 4 million bricks each year. 4 million. Every single brick shaped by hand, dried under the sun, and fired in massive kilns that burned day and night. The heat from those kilns was unbearable. Temperatures inside could rise above 2,000 degrees. The air was heavy with smoke and ash. And the workers who fed the kilns, who carried the bricks, who mixed clay with bare feet, were not grown men. Many of them were children. The Hallbeck family kept detailed records. Enslaved people were considered property, and property had to be counted. According to records from 1857, there were 225 enslaved people living at Boone Hall. 51 of them were children under the age of 15, 51 children who had never known freedom, 51 children who had never experienced a day without work, 51 children whose lives were defined by the color of their skin. Let me tell you about one of them. Her name was Celia. She was 11 years old. She was born on the plantation, just like her mother before her. She had never seen the ocean, even though it was only a few miles away. She had never owned shoes. She had never eaten a full meal without hunger returning hours later. But Celia had something the Hallbecks could never take. She had a mind that would not stop thinking. Each morning, Celia woke before sunrise in a small brick cabin on what overseers called Slave Street. 9 identical cabins stood in a line, each holding between 6 and 15 people. The cabins had been built by enslaved workers many years earlier and stood as a cruel reminder of the system. The bricks were strong. The people inside were meant to feel weak. Celia shared her cabin with her mother, her grandmother, 2 younger brothers, and 3 other families. There was one fireplace. There was no privacy. There was no comfort. At the sound of the horn, Celia rose with the others. She ate whatever scraps were available, usually cornmeal mixed with water, sometimes a small piece of salted fish. On rare days, her grandmother would bring out a sweet potato she had hidden from the overseer. These small acts of resistance were risky, but they were necessary. Without them, the children would have starved. By the time the sun rose, Celia was already walking toward the brick kilns. Her job was to carry unfired bricks from the drying yard to the kilns. Each brick weighed about 5 pounds. She carried 2 at a time, 1 in each hand, walking the same path again and again until her arms burned with pain. She made this trip hundreds of times every day. The overseer at the kilns was a white man named Thomas Garrett. He was known for 2 things, efficiency and cruelty. Garrett believed enslaved people, including children, were naturally lazy. He believed punishment was the only way to force work. He carried a cowhide whip and used it often. Celia had felt that whip on her back more times than she could. Remember, the scars crossed her skin like rivers. But Garrett had a weakness, Celia noticed. He could not read. Each week, a wagon arrived from Charleston with supplies and letters, orders from buyers, invoices and messages from the Hallbeck family, who rarely visited the plantation. Garrett took these papers to the main house, where a house servant read them aloud. And Celia, who sometimes helped in the kitchen, listened closely. She memorized words. She connected sounds to letters. She taught herself patterns. It was slow and dangerous. If discovered, she would be whipped or sold away from her family. But Celia understood something many adults had forgotten. Knowledge was power, and power was the only path to freedom. In the spring of 1857, something unusual happened at Boone Hall. A new overseer arrived to assist Garrett. His name was William Crawford, and unlike Garrett, he came from a different background. He was raised in Maryland, a border state where slavery still existed, but opinions were beginning to change. Crawford was not an abolitionist. He was not a friend to the enslaved, but he was not cruel by nature. He was a man trying to survive in a system he inherited. Crawford noticed what Garrett ignored. He saw how thin the children were. He noticed their constant coughing from kiln smoke. He saw that 2 of the youngest workers, a 7-year-old boy and an 8-year-old girl, could barely stand by day's end. And he noticed Celia, the way she watched, the way she listened, the way her eyes moved when someone read aloud. One evening, Crawford did something that changed many lives. He left a newspaper in the stable where older enslaved workers slept. He later claimed it was an accident. But the paper carried dangerous news. It reported a Supreme Court decision just announced, the Dred Scott decision. The news spread through the quarters like fire. The Higay Sink Court in the land declared that black people, enslaved or free, could never be citizens. They had no rights white people were required to respect. They were property, nothing more. The decision was meant to end the slavery debate. Instead, it sparked something stronger. Among the 51 children of Boone Hall, a quiet change began. They whispered to one another. They listened closely to adult conversations. They asked questions their parents feared to answer. What is freedom? Where is the North? Is it true black people live free elsewhere? Could we escape? Celia became the center of this awakening. Her small ability to recognize words made her important. She glanced at discarded papers. She memorized phrases and shared them with the others. She became their teacher, even while still learning herself. But she also became a target. By midsummer, Garrett sensed something had changed. The children were more aware, more organized. They whispered too often. They looked at him with eyes that held more than fear. There was something else now, something dangerous. Garrett did not understand it, but he knew he hated it. On the morning of August 14, 1857, Garrett ordered all 51 children to the center of the workyard. He lined them up under the burning sun. He walked slowly past them, studying their faces, searching for the source of the change. When he reached Celia, he stopped. "There's something about you," he said, "something in your eyes." Celia stayed silent. She had learned silence caused less pain. Garrett grabbed her arm and pulled her from the line. He dragged her to the whipping post near the kilns. The other children watched in terror. Some of the youngest cried. No one moved. They knew helping her would only bring more punishment. What Garrett did not know was that Celia had hidden something in her clothes that morning. A small scrap of paper, part of a letter, S, he had found near the main house. It held an address in Philadelphia, the address of someone who helped enslaved people escape. Celia did not fully understand it, but she knew it mattered. And she knew that if Garrett found it, she would not survive. As Garrett raised his whip, Celia made a choice that would define her life. She did not cry. She did not beg. She looked straight into Garrett's eyes and smiled. It was not a smile of joy. It was a smile of resistance, a smile that said, "You can break my body, but you will never break my mind." Garrett hesitated. For one brief moment he was confused. Enslaved people did not smile when punishment came. They shook with fear. They begged. They gave in. But this girl, this 11-year-old child, looked at him as if she already understood something he did not. And in that brief pause, something unexpected happened. The bell at the main house began to ring. Not the usual bell that marked meals or work shifts. This bell rang fast and sharp, a sound that meant only one thing: emergency, fire, danger. Garrett dropped his whip and ran toward the house. The other overseers ran after him. For the first time anyone could remember, the enslaved workers were left standing in the yard without supervision. Celia did not run. She knew that running would only confirm whatever doubts Garrett already had. Instead, she calmly returned to the line of children. She reached out and took her younger brother's hand and whispered one word that would echo through generations to come: "Remember." The fire at the main house turned out to be small, a kitchen accident that was quickly handled. But in those few confused minutes, something at Boone Hall had changed. The children had seen an enslaver hesitate. They had watched one of their own stand unbroken in the face of pain. They had felt, even for a short time, what it was like to stand together without control watching them. The summer of 1857 was the hottest anyone could recall. The kilns burned without rest. The demand for bricks never slowed. And the children of Boone Hall continued their secret learning. Celia taught them words. The older boys showed the younger ones how to move quietly through the woods. The girls learned to send messages through songs that sounded harmless but held hidden meaning. They were creating something their enslavers could not see. They were forming a community. They were building resistance. They were holding on to hope. But hope under slavery was dangerous, and the months ahead would test every one of those 51 children in ways they could never imagine. The first warning came in September. A slave trader arrived at Boone Hall from New Orleans. His name was Silas Monroe, and he was known across the South as a successful dealer of human lives. Monroe specialized in what traders called prime stock, young and healthy workers who brought the highest prices on cotton and sugar plantations in the Deep South. He had heard that Boone Hall had an unusual number of strong children. The Hallbeck family was under financial pressure. Brick prices had fallen because of competition. Several investments had failed, and the family patriarch, old Henry Hallbeck, had died the year before, leaving the estate to sons more interested in spending than saving. When Monroe made his offer, the younger Hallbecks saw a solution. Monroe wanted to buy 20 of the 51 children. He offered high prices, 300 degrees Fahrenheit, or the youngest and up to $800 for older children with skills. The total sale would bring in more than $12,000, enough to clear their debts and still have money left. When word of the possible sale reached the quarters, fear spread fast. 20 children, nearly half of their young group. Brothers could be torn from sisters, friends could be separated forever. Children who had grown, learned, and survived together could be scattered across hundreds of miles. The adults tried to protect the children from the truth, but children notice everything. They heard whispers, they saw tears in their mother's eyes, they felt conversations stop when they entered a space. They knew something terrible was coming. Celia gathered the children one night when the moon was hidden. They met in the woods behind the last cabin, in a clearing they had found months before. It was their place of learning, and now it became their place of planning. "We cannot stop them from selling us," Celia said. She was only 11, but her voice carried the weight of someone who had suffered deeply. "We cannot fight them with our hands. We cannot outrun their horses. But we can do something they will never expect. We can make sure that no matter where they send us, we never forget who we are." The children listened quietly. Some cried. Some were too shocked to cry. All of them listened. Celia shared a plan that was simple but powerful. They would create a way to find one another again. They would memorize names, places, and family ties. Each child would learn their own story and the stories of at least 5 others. They would keep this knowledge in their minds where no trader could steal it. And when freedom finally came, they would use that knowledge to rebuild what slavery had destroyed. It was a desperate plan, a child's plan, but it was also wise, because Celia understood something many adults had forgotten. Slavery depended on isolation. It survived by keeping people divided, confused, and alone. The greatest resistance was not escape. It was connection. Over the next 3 weeks, while talks between the Hallbecks and Silas Monroe dragged on, the children of Boone Hall created something remarkable. They built a memory system using songs, rhythms, and stories. Each child had a melody. Each family tie was placed into a verse. Each location became a movement, a tap, a gesture. They practiced late at night while overseers slept. They tested one another. They corrected mistakes. They held each other when fear became too heavy, and they made a promise that would stay with them forever. No matter what happens, we will find each other again. The sale was set for the last week of October. Monroe arrived with his wagon, his chains, and his paperwork. The Hallbecks agreed to sell 22 children, 2 more than first planned. The extra children were siblings of those already chosen. The Hallbecks believed selling siblings together would prevent unrest among adult workers. Better to sell them as a group. The morning of the sale was cold and gray. Fog rolled in from the coast, covering the plantation in thick mist. The selected children were lined up near the main gate. They wore clean clothes, a rare thing that made the moment even more painful. They were being prepared like goods for market. Celia was not chosen. She was considered too valuable as a worker and perhaps too dangerous to send away. The Hallbecks wanted her close, where they could watch her. But her younger brother James was on the list. He was 9 years old, strong for his age, and valued at $400. As the children climbed into Monroe's wagon, Celia stood at the edge of the quarters and watched. She did not cry. She had promised James she would not. Instead, she hummed a soft, simple tune that floated through the fog like a quiet prayer. One by one, the children in the wagon joined the melody. Their voices blended into one low, haunting sound. The overseers heard it but did not understand. Monroe heard it and ignored it, thinking it was normal sorrow. Only the children knew its meaning. It was a message, a promise, a vow hidden in song. We will remember. We will survive. We will find each other again. The wagon rolled away, and 22 of the 51 children of Boone Hall vanished into the fog. They were taken to New Orleans, where they would be sold again at the largest slave market in the Western Hemisphere. Some would go to Louisiana, others to Mississippi or Texas. They would labor in cotton fields, sugar mills, and wealthy homes where their names meant nothing. But they carried something no bill of sale could list. They carried the songs, they carried the memories, they carried the knowledge of who they were and where they came from. In the years that followed, through the final days of slavery, through the Civil War, emancipation, and Reconstruction, those songs would prove more powerful than anyone expected. But that story comes later. For now, we leave Boone Hall in the fall of 1857. 29 children remained on the plantation. 22 were scattered across the South. The chains of slavery still held them all, but something inside had changed, something no master could own, something called hope. The winter of 1857 was harsh. Temperatures fell lower than anyone at Boone Hall remembered. The kilns had to be kept burning non-stop, and the 29 children left behind worked harder than ever, filling the space left by those who were gone. Celia felt the loss like an open wound. Each morning she woke expecting to hear James breathing nearby. Each night she reached for a hand that was no longer there. The cabin felt emptier, colder, and silent. But Celia refused to fall into despair. She had made a promise, and she meant to keep it. In the weeks after the sale, Celia became even more focused on learning. She took bigger risks, sneaking looks at newspapers, listening closely to talks in the main house, and memorizing every bit of information that might be useful one day. She learned that the country was moving closer to war. She learned that a man named Abraham Lincoln was speaking out against slavery in the northern states. She learned that there were places called Canada and Mexico where enslaved people could live free if they could reach them. But she also learned something else, something that would shape the next part of her life. One night in early December, Celia overheard a conversation between William Crawford, the overseer who sometimes showed surprising kindness, and a visitor from Charleston. The visitor was a free black man named Robert Smalls. He worked on the docks, loading and unloading ships. He was also, though Celia did not know it then, building a network that would later help him become one of the most remarkable figures of the Civil War. Smalls had come to Boone Hall to deliver a shipment of supplies, but that was not his real reason for being there. He was collecting information, mapping plantations, learning which overseers were cruel and which were simply careless, and noticing which enslaved people might be willing to take great risks when the right moment came. Crawford had no idea about any of this. To him, Smalls was just a black man doing his job. But Celia, watching quietly from the darkness, noticed more. She saw how Smalls moved, how he seemed to see everything without making it obvious, how his eyes passed over the slave quarters with both sadness and careful thought. She knew that look because she had seen it in her own reflection. As Smalls prepared to leave, Celia did something extremely dangereux. She stepped out of the shadows and into the weak circle of lantern light near the stable. She said nothing. She only raised her hand and made a gesture she had learned from one of the older women in the quarters. To most people, it meant nothing. But to those who understood, it was a signal, a quiet question. "Are you one of us?" Smalls stopped. For a long moment, he looked at the 11-year-old girl who had appeared out of nowhere, holding a secret sign in her fingers. Then, very slightly, he nodded. That was all. One small nod in the dark. But it was enough. Celia now knew the outside world had not forgotten them. There were people working toward freedom, and one day, somehow, that work would reach Boone Hall. The year 1858 brought new worries. The Hallbeck family, encouraged by the money from the previous year's sale, began thinking about selling more of the enslaved people. Rumors moved through the quarters constantly. Every time a stranger arrived, every time overseers met in private, every time a wagon came without warning, the enslaved workers feared another separation. Celia used this constant fear to strengthen the network she had built among the children. She taught them to watch carefully, to listen closely, and to remember details. Each child was given a specific task. Some watched the overseers. Some followed the movements of visitors. Some learned to recognize different kinds of wagons, knowing which carried supplies and which carried traders. Without fully understanding it, they became an intelligence network. Children who were invisible to the adults who controlled their lives, yet always watching, always remembering, waiting for the moment when their knowledge would become power. By the summer of 1858, Celia had taught herself to read at a basic level. It had taken more than a year of stolen minutes, serious risks, and sleepless nights. But she company. Ewald now understands simple papers, bills of sale, letters, and newspaper headlines. This made her more important to her community, but it also made her more exposed. If the Hallbecks discovered that an enslaved child could read, the punishment would be severe. In South Carolina, teaching an enslaved person to read was illegal. The teacher might be fined. The student often faced death. Still, Celia did not keep her knowledge to herself. She began teaching other children using the same memory methods she had used before the sale. They learned the alphabet through songs. They practiced spelling through games. They met secretly in the woods and in the narrow spaces between cabins where shadows hid them. Slowly and with great effort, a new group of literate black children began to grow at Boone Hall. They called themselves the Memory Keepers. It was a name Celia chose because it fit their purpose. They would remember the past, the names and faces of those who had been sold away, and they would prepare for the future by learning skills needed to survive in a fast-changing world. By 1859, the tension in the nation had reached a breaking point. In October, a white abolitionist named John Brown led a raid on the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He hoped to take weapons and arm enslaved people for a large uprising. The raid failed. Brown was captured and hanged, but his actions sent fear through the South. Plantation owners grew suspicious. Security tightened. Punishments became harsher. The chance that Celia and her network had been waiting for seemed to be slipping away. Then, in the spring of 1860, everything shifted again. A new overseer arrived at Boone Hall. His name was Jeremiah Stone, and he was different from any overseer before him. Stone was from the north, originally from Pennsylvania, and had come south looking for work and money. He did not believe in racial equality. He was not an abolitionist, but he was also not cruel for pleasure. He viewed slavery as a business and believed businesses ran better when workers were fed, healthy, and not constantly terrified. Under Stone's control, life at Boone Hall improved slightly. Children still worked in the fields, but for fewer hours. Food rations increased. The whip was still there, but it was used less often. It was not freedom, and it was not fairness. But it gave the memory keepers enough breathing room to expand their work. By the end of 1860, Celia was 14 years old. She had grown tall and strong despite the hardships of her childhood. Her reading skills had improved greatly, and she now understood ideas that would have been impossible for her just a few years earlier. She knew the country was close to breaking apart. She knew that a man named Lincoln might become president and that his victory could push the southern states toward rebellion. And she understood that war could create chances for freedom that had never existed before. In November of 1860, Lincoln won the election. By December, South Carolina voted to leave the Union. Boone Hall, like every plantation in the state, fell into chaos. The Hallbeck family began storing supplies. Overseers drilled enslaved workers on emergency routines, and talk of war filled the air. Celia called a meeting of the memory keepers on the night of December 20th, the same day South Carolina officially left the United States. There were now 18 children, aged 8 to 16. They met in their hidden clearing, wrapped against the cold, their breath visible in the icy air. "War is coming," Celia told them. "I do not know when or how long it will last, but I know this. War brings confusion, and confusion brings opportunity. We must be ready." She shared a plan she had been building in her mind for months. When war began, the plantation would be disrupted. Overseers might leave to join the Confederate Army. Supplies could run low. The family might even abandon the land if fighting came too close. In that confusion, those who were ready would have a chance. Those who were not ready would stay enslaved. The memory keepers would prepare. They would hide small amounts of food. They would learn the land around them. They would mark paths leading north toward Union forces. They would memorize the names of people who might help them, and they would wait. Waiting was the hardest part. The war began in April 1861 with the attack on Fort Sumter, only miles from Boone Hall. The children heard the cannons across the water. They saw smoke rising in the distance. They knew history was happening, and they could only watch. For the next 2 years, life at Boone Hall existed in a strange pause between the old world and the new. The plantation kept running, but everything felt temporary and uncertain. Overseers came and went. Members of the Hallbeck family argued about what to do. Some wanted to sell everything and escape to Europe. Others wanted to stay and wait for the Confederacy to win. Meanwhile, the memory keepers continued their work. Their numbers grew from 18 to 23. Their network expanded to include a few trusted adults who shared their hope for freedom. They mapped every road, path, and waterway within 20 miles of the plantation. They knew where Union ships moved along the coast. They knew which plantations had been abandoned. They felt freedom getting closer every day. In the summer of 1862, something incredible happened. A ship appeared off the coast with a black pilot who had done the impossible. Robert Smalls, the same man who had nodded to Celia 5 years earlier, had taken control of a Confederate ship called the Planter and delivered it to the Union Navy. His brave act made him a hero in the Naboa, RTH, and a symbol of fear in the South. News of Smalls's escape spread through the quarters like fire. If he could do it, others could too. Freedom was no longer just a dream. It was real, achieved by someone they knew, someone who had walked the same ground. Celia moved her plans forward faster, but freedom still came with danger. In September 1862, disaster struck the memory keepers. One of the younger boys, a 10-year-old named Peter, was caught with a piece of paper hidden in his pocket. On it was a rough map of the roads leading north. It was clearly the work of children, rough and unfinished, but the overseers knew exactly what it meant. It was proof of an escape plan. Peter was questioned for 3 days. He was whipped. He was denied food. He was threatened with being sold to the harshest plantation in Louisiana, but he never revealed the memory keepers. He never said Celia's name. He never betrayed his friends. On the 4th day, Peter was found dead in the punishment shed. The official explanation was that he had died from a fever, but everyone in the quarters knew the truth. He had been beaten to death for daring to dream about freedom. The memory keepers mourned quietly. They could not show their sorrow, could not hold a real funeral. could not even admit that Peter had been anything more than another enslaved child. But in the darkness of their hidden clearing, they made a new promise. Peter's death would not be meaningless. His bravery would be remembered, and his dream would be carried forward. The year 1863 brought news that changed everything. On January 1st, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that all enslaved people in Confederate states were now legally free. The proclamation had no immediate effect at Boone Hall. The Confederacy rejected Lincoln's authority, and Union soldiers had not yet reached the plantation. Still, the impact on their minds was enormous. Freedom was no longer just hope. It was now the law. The United States government had declared that Celia and every other enslaved person had the right to liberty. All they had to do was take it. The next 2 years were the most dangerous of Celia's life. As Union forces moved deeper into the South, Confederate leaders grew desperate. Enslaved people who showed even small signs of resistance were punished harshly. Overseers who had once been simply cruel became fearful and violent. The Hallbeck family began planning to move their most valuable, enslaved people farther inland, away from the advancing Union Army. Celia knew that if the memory keepers were moved, all their careful planning would be lost. They would be starting again in unfamiliar land, separated from the roots they knew and the contacts they trusted. They had to act before the move happened. In February of 1865, with Union troops only 30 miles away, Celia made her choice. The time had come. She gathered the memory keepers for the last time. There were 19 children now, along with 7 adults who had joined their network. They would leave in 3 groups, each taking a different path to reduce the risk. If one group was caught, the others might still succeed. They would travel only at night, using the stars and landmarks they had memorized. They would stay away from roads and towns. They would trust no white person except those whose names came from reliable sources. The first group left on the night of February 23rd. The second group left 2 nights later. Celia was part of the third group, which left on February 27th. She was now 18 years old, fully grown, though she had never been allowed a true childhood. The journey north lasted 11 days. 11 days of walking through swamps, hiding in empty barns, and surviving on whatever food they could find. They hunted by dogs. On the third night, they hid inside a hollow log for an entire day, while a Confederate patrol passed just yards away. They nearly drowned while crossing a river swollen by winter rain. But they kept going, always moving, always heading north. On March 10, 1865, Celia's group reached a Union Army camp outside Fayetteville, North Carolina. A black soldier saw them coming out of the trees, torn clothes, exhausted, barely standing. He ran toward them with tears on his face. "You made it," he said. "My God, you made it. You are free." Celia dropped to her knees in the mud. For the first time in her life she let herself cry, not tears of pain or loss, but tears of joy so strong they shook her whole body. She was free. She was finally, unbelievably, miraculously free. But her journey was not finished. In many ways it was just starting. After the war ended in April of 1865, Celia devoted herself to a mission that would define the rest of her life. She would find the 22 children who had been sold from Boone Hall in 1857. She would keep the promise she made on that foggy October morning. She would reunite her family. The task was almost impossible. The slave trade had scattered those children across hundreds of miles. Many had been sold more than once. Some had been given new names. Some had died under the brutal conditions of cotton and sugar plantations in the deep South. But Celia had tools no one could have predicted. She could read, she could write, and she had the songs the memory keepers created before the sale were never forgotten. The children who were sold carried those melodies with them. They sang them in the fields of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas. They taught them to others. After the war, those songs became a way for broken families to find each other. Celia placed notices in black newspapers across the South. She described the songs, the tunes, and the hidden words. She shared her address and asked anyone who recognized the music to write to her. Slowly, almost unbelievably, replies began to come. The first letter arrived in the fall of 1866. It came from a freed man in New Orleans who had heard a young woman singing one of the Boone Hall songs on a street corner. He asked her where she learned it. She said she had learned it as a child on a plantation in South Carolina from a girl named Celia. It was Celia's friend Sarah. She had been sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana at age 10. She survived the war and was now working as a seamstress in New Orleans. Within a month, Celia was on a steamship heading south to find her. Over the next 20 years, Celia found 14 of the 22 children who had been sold. Some had died before freedom came. Others disappeared into the chaos of war and rebuilding. But 14 were alive. 14 remembered. 14 kept singing the songs Celia had taught them. And James, Celia's younger brother? The 9-year-old boy sold for $400 on that gray October morning. It took Celia 15 years to find him. James had been sold 3 times. He worked cotton fields in Mississippi, a sugar refinery in Louisiana, and later on a small plantation in Texas. As a teenager, he was beaten so badly that he lost hearing in one ear, but he never stopped searching for his sister. In 1872, a letter reached Celia from a small town in eastern Texas. It was written slowly, with uncertain letters, by a man who had only recently learned to write. The letter described a melody from his childhood, a melody his sister had taught him before they were separated. Celia traveled to Texas that winter. She found James working as a sharecropper on the same land where he had once been enslaved. He was 34 years old, thin and worn by hard years, but alive. When he saw Celia walking toward him across a frozen field, he fell to his knees and began humming the song they had shared as children. They held each other for nearly an hour, witnesses said. They did not speak. They simply held on, cried, and remembered. The story of the 51 children of Boone Hall did not end happily for everyone. 8 of the children were never found. Peter, the memory keeper, was killed for daring to imagine freedom. Many others suffered in ways that left scars seen and unseen. But this story is not only about pain, it is about resistance, it is about memory. It is about children who refused to believe they were less than human. Celia lived until 1912. She died at 66 in a small house in Philadelphia, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, all free. In her final years, she wrote down the songs of the memory keepers so future generations would not forget. Those songs are still sung today, though few know where they came from. The brick cabins of Slave Street still stand at Boone Hall Plantation. Visitors walk through them each year, reading signs about the lives of the enslaved. Some notice the fingerprints pressed into the bricks. Most assume they belong to adults. But if you look closely, many of them are small. They are the fingerprints of children, children meant to be forgotten, children whose names were erased, children who built a city with their labor and shaped a future with their courage. 51 children lived at Boone Hall in 1857. They were not footnotes. They were not numbers. They were human beings with dreams, fears, hopes, and pain. They loved their families. They missed their friends. They wanted to learn. They wanted to grow. They wanted freedom. And in the end, against all odds, many of them found it. Not because it was handed to them, but because they took it. Not because they were rescued, but because they saved themselves. This is their legacy. This is their truth. And this is why we must never forget. The bricks of Charleston still stand. The fingerprints remain. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the children singing. We will remember. We will survive. We will find each other again. They did.